This next panel, we titled it The Merits and Politics of Private Auction versus Public Auction. And as we heard in the first discussion from Mr. Noor, he thinks that is kind of the key fault line. There's obviously a lot of other issues to this proceeding beyond that, and I'm happy to get into all of those. To the extent we can. We can't get down into all the weeds. Someone said, let's don't get down too far into all the technical nasty weeds here, and that's fine with me. But we do got to get into some of those issues, at least at a certain layer of granularity, but we don't have to get to everything. But this first issue, merits, politics, private auction versus public auction, it does seem to have really attracted some of the main focus of this proceeding. And to discuss this, we have 5 panelists today. And we're gonna start by just having them lay out their basic views on how they see that question, and then any other key questions they want to highlight at the beginning. And then we'll give them a chance to respond to each other, and hopefully we'll get a little bit of a spontaneous combustion conversation going. To the extent we don't, I'll have some questions, and we'll also throw it open to the audience, and happy to have as much of a discussion as we can on this. So first, just to introduce, starting right to my left, your all's right, we have Jerry Oberst at SES, the Senior Vice President, Global Advocacy, and you're here representing the C-Band Alliance, I believe.
Yes.
Okay. Next to him is Phil Berenbrock, Public Knowledge, Senior Policy Counsel. Next to him is Ross Lieberman, ACA Connects, the new name for the American Cable Association, now called ACA Connects America's Communications Association, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs. Next to Ross is Patrick McFadden, National Association of Broadcasters, Associate General Counsel, Legal and Regulatory Affairs. And then last but not least, we have Jill Canfield of the NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association, Vice President of Legal and Industry, Assistant General Counsel. So I put it in this order to try to, I thought we'd give the CBA a chance kind of, since you all have done a lot to kind of get this proceeding moving along. We're going to give you the first word and then just go right down the line here as to your basic views, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think Alex and John set the stage for why 5G and use of mid-band spectrum is important in the first session. In fact, John, and I'll quote him, said that 5G is super important. So that's a national priority. But from the satellite perspective, there's another national priority, and that's protecting the distribution of radio and audio signals to 100 million households around the country. Our birds serve that many households, and our customers, in turn, have $100 billion annually in revenue. Now, the C-band is used for this because of its ultra-reliability. But we can read the tea leaves, and we see the pressure, and we've tried to come up with an approach that deals with both of those national priorities. Last year, the FCC asked in a notice of proposed rulemaking for how we could clear part of the mid-band, this C-band that we've been talking about. The satellite operators responded by creating the CBA Alliance, the C-band Alliance, the CBA, which I'm representing, and we submitted a solution that we felt would both clear spectrum and ensure ongoing reliable service for the entire U.S. broadcast infrastructure. Now, let me give you a few words on how the CBA proposal works to set the stage. Now, our satellites today, the 4 satellite operators in the CBA, use 500 megahertz of spectrum in the C-band from every orbital location serving the continental United States. The CBA's plan is to clear a block of 200 megahertz of that at the lower end of the band. We'd transition existing customer traffic in that 200 megahertz up to the upper 300 megahertz. Now, this approach only works if we buy 8 new satellites, if we reassign the satellite transmission capacity for well over 100 radio and television networks, and we install filters in each and every antenna and each and every receiver station around the country so we can protect against higher powered 5G signals. Now, we feel we can accomplish this transition of the entire U.S. broadcast ecosystem in 18 to 36 months, but the timing and the amount of spectrum that we would propose to clear is based on the capabilities of our fleet and our contractual commitments. Now, to fund this approach, the new satellites, the network restructuring, and to incentivize the satellite operators, we would pursue market-based transactions with terrestrial wireless operators who want to use this spectrum for 5G. All of the transactions will be subject to FCC approval. The band plan will be subject to FCC approval. The service rules for that operation will be subject to FCC approval. There will be a public interest overview which remains. That was a point made in the earlier discussion, and the FCC remains in the middle. Now that's the basic background. The key question for this panel is private transaction versus public FCC-run auction. A lot of the CBA opponents actually argue the FCC should run the auction. We heard this morning earlier. Or the government should participate in the proceeds. Well, for those who are really interested in 5G deployment and all the economic benefits that will create, it boils really down to one thing, and that's timing. That needs to be the real topic of all of our discussion. How can we get this done quickly? Not who does it or how it's done. Because if we focus on quickly, then we're going to come down to a set of hard facts, contractual commitments, holdout rights, and comparisons to even the fastest action that the FCC could undertake with an auction. If we look at those facts, the answer is going to be pretty obvious. A market-based solution with FCC oversight will be the fastest way to accomplish these goals. Now, we've seen that government-run reallocations and auctions of spectrum have historically taken many years to complete, from 7 to more than 10 years in the most recent examples. This is not a dig at the FCC. It's a necessary part of setting auction rules and of complying with all the administrative procedures that would be necessary. The speed that would be accomplished through a market-based approach would produce enormous gains to American consumers, to businesses, to security interests, and those proceeds would dwarf any amount that might go to the Treasury in public auction years from now. And if we go down that road, by that time the US will have given up any hope of leadership in 5G. Now, we submitted input from respected economists, Coleman Bazelon of the Brattle Group and Jeffrey Eisenach of NERA in support of these conclusions. Coleman pointed out that every year of delay causes multi-billion dollars in costs and lost benefits. Professor Eisenach noted that consumer welfare gains from rapid allocation of the C-band spectrum, and quoting his words, will far exceed any government revenues that would be generated by more administrative process. The Treasury would receive substantial additional revenues from economic growth generated by rapid C-band repurposing. He also noted that the FCC has approved literally thousands of transactions involving spectrum where the sellers realized economic gains. I mean, that's just a normal part of our system. We're not even sure how the FCC would run an incentive auction were they to do so. Any incentive auction has built-in problems. John pointed this out earlier. Each CBA member holds independent rights to use the entire 500 megahertz around the country to provide C-band service. A government-run approach without CBA agreement gives big incentives for holdouts and will create much more delay. But finally, how does a government-run auction create the new satellites and the filters and the interference commitments which we've offered? A central element of the CBA approach is that it gives an incentive and a plan to the satellite operators who, after all, have invested billions of dollars to provide C-band service to the country for over 4 decades. The CBA proposal commits to clearing spectrum in 18 to 36 months. This will accelerate 5G innovation that's estimated to be about $500 billion in US GDP growth by 2027 if we act quickly. And that is why a private market-based approach wins hands down as the best policy for the United States.
Well, thanks to Dave and to Teddy here at Capital Forum for having me. I'm Philip Ehrenbrook. I'm with Public Knowledge. And I not only represent Public Knowledge, but Public Knowledge in this proceeding has been part of the Public Interest Spectrum Coalition, which represents other entities like New America's Open Technology Institute, Common Cause, and several other consumer and public interest organizations. So while I don't necessarily speak for them, we've associated with each other in this proceeding. So what I represent hopefully is not too divergent from where the rest of our coalition is. So we filed comments and reply comments at the FCC last year and earlier this year in response to the C-band Alliance's proposal. And I want to highlight just a couple of things that Jerry said that we agree with. So first, yes, 5G deployment is a national priority. Yes, protecting users in the band is important. Priority that was not mentioned, though, very quickly, is solving the digital divide, the rural broadband problem that we face. I can't name for you the number of congressional hearings that happened last year. I'm sure somebody in the room could rattle off a number that were held last year or last Congress discussing the importance of rural broadband deployment, both fixed and wireless. And we even saw the introduction of legislation, the Airwaves Act, which dealt with auctions in the millimeter wave bands. It dealt with allocating the C-band or some portions of the C-band for mobile use. But then it also said we would set aside 10% of those auction revenues for a rural broadband dividend, essentially, to go and help us close the digital divide. That conversation is entirely missing from this proceeding, other than some of what PIST has brought to it. I know NTCA has discussed it, and WISPA has discussed it as well. But that's an important national priority that this FCC chairman has said is the core priority to his entire chairmanship. And I think it does need to be front and center in this proceeding. So that's it. Moving to the private sale versus public auction issue that we're sort of teed up here. Public knowledge opposes the private sale for a few different reasons. Number one, we simply think that it doesn't pass muster under the Communications Act. We think under Section 309J of the Communications Act, or of 47 USC, it violates that portion of the statute. So we think, John said earlier that what was important wasn't necessarily speed on the front end, that you might want to sacrifice some speed on the front end here to make sure we get it right and to make sure we're mitigating litigation risk. And I think that is especially important here as we consider the potential problems with compliance with Section 309J. Additionally, not only do we have the statute itself, we have prior congressional action on issues like this. So in 2002, prior to the DTV transition, I know NAB is entirely familiar with this situation, but in 2002, before we even had the DTV transition, there was an effort to essentially do not necessarily a private auction, but an auction of some of the unused TV channels at the top of the TV band. And Congress actually stepped in with bipartisan legislation that said, you couldn't do this unjust enrichment proposal. And so they passed the Auction Reform Act of 2002. Similarly, in 2012, we saw the Spectrum Act passed, which told the FCC that as it was repurposing some of that 600 megahertz band for flexible use, that it needed to run an incentive auction, or gave the authority to the FCC to do an incentive auction. We think that those are important precedents that the FCC needs to consider here. Congress has repeatedly stepped in and said proposals similar to what the C-band Alliance is proposing, simply are disfavored and potentially illegal under the Communications Act. Finally, I think our other concerns with the private sale, and like I said, we support a public auction in this proceeding with transparency that's run by the FCC. Some of the other issues that we have with the private sale proposal, frankly, I think we see in the marketplace right now, the wireless marketplace, that you have 4 nationwide providers, you have regional and rural providers that are competing and need access to mid-band spectrum and millimeter wave spectrum to bring 5G and next generation connectivity to their communities. We have serious concerns that a private sale will exacerbate the competition problems that we see in the wireless market right now, and will exacerbate the digital divide rather than help narrow the digital divide, because we're worried that those smaller providers and communities are left behind. And then finally, the other issue is, like I mentioned before with the Airwaves Act, there was some bipartisan interest in the last Congress in finding consensus around, allocating money specifically for rural broadband deployment that came from some of these auction revenues. That is a strong proposal, and we think it merits reconsideration this Congress. And frankly, we think that the private sale proposal makes that much more difficult to accomplish. If you think about, what the FCC back in, I guess it was January 2017, the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis had a report where it sort of looked at how much money would actually be needed for rural broadband to close the digital divide, and I think this was about fiber deployment. But it was $40 to $80 billion. 40 to get to the last to get to 98% deployment, another 40 to get to that last 2%. And so you can imagine some of the money that could potentially be taken into Treasury from auction of some of the C-band would be helpful in meeting that need. So that's where public knowledge is, and I'm happy to discuss with the rest of the panelists.
Russ?
Thank you. Appreciate the invitation to speak here by the Capitol Forum, and it's good to see many friends out there who are here to listen to this important panel. So just to give you a little bit of background, so the C-band spectrum provides the only path for video delivery which is used by small and medium-sized cable television operators, particularly those in rural areas, who then transmit that video program to millions of their customers. ACA Connect's members, along with other C-band users, by even the CBA's own economist, has estimated that there's been over $12 billion spent by these Earth station users in C-band facilities for the purposes that they're using it today. Their rights to use this spectrum is no less than the rights of the satellite industry. And the FCC, and so as we know, the FCC is considering refarming a significant portion of that spectrum for another use, 5G wireless service. ACA Connect is not opposed to the refarming of the C-band. We understand the benefits that making it available for other uses can afford, but, and it's an important if, it must be done in a way that ACA Connect's members are kept whole. As we know, that the 4 of the major C-band satellite operators have put forth a plan that would be a private sale of a portion of the C-band, which in total is worth close to $60 billion. And the CBA claims that it could reallocate this amount to spectrum in a way that would cause minimum disruption to existing users. There have been others out there that have made their own proposals. We've seen T-Mobile, CTIA, and others that have called for a much more significant amount of spectrum to be reallocated in the range of 300 megahertz or more. I want to be clear that the idea that satellite service using a fraction of the spectrum today is an adequate substitute for the use of the entire band is a non-starter. The C-band the CBA proposal, to begin with, threatens many harms. It's the loss of programming or lower quality resolution of the programming that isn't made available, higher prices, the need to use alternative means to get that programming that can't be done over the C-band anymore, which could include fiber, which then means the cost of getting that fiber to those systems in order to receive it. It's the destruction of the value that all of these Earth station users have put in the C-band, in their C-band facilities. The loss of the rights of the spectrum, and finally, and I think from our members' perspective, this is sort of the least of the worries, is the interference. We're glad to see that there's been efforts made to try to mitigate that problem, but that's a small fraction of the concerns that many of ACA Connect's members have with the reallocation of the spectrum. Now, the proposals that have been made to allocate even more spectrum are more concerning to ACA Connect's members. In some cases, they could be lethal to their continued viability in the markets that they're serving. There's another non-starter in terms of this debate for us. It's that spectrum could be refarmed at different levels in urban areas as in rural areas. You know, if you leave rural users having to shoulder the entire cost of an aging satellite fleet, whose costs were previously borne by urban and urban and rural users alike, that creates a big problem for rural users and the continued viability of using the band at all. Now, a lot of direness in that beginning, but let me say that, reiterate, we do believe, we do understand that there is benefit to the reallocation of C-band for 5G uses, and we do believe that there can be a holistic solution and believe that it's necessary and possible where it can serve the interests of all parties, whether including the satellite industry, Earth station users, and the public, and that solution can treat rural users and urban users alike. The CBA has put forward its proposal. We have raised concerns about it. Thus far, they've been unwilling to fully address the concerns that we've outlined. I think others have. There is another approach. An FCC-led auction, possibly coupled with an incentive auction, may be the best way to provide benefits to all of those stakeholders. Thanks.
Patrick.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate it. David, I probably should have warned you that I was going to need a trigger warning before anybody used the words incentive auction in the room. That said, I'll be uncharacteristically brief. Anybody who knows me knows that ordinarily the problem is getting me to shut up on a panel, but I don't want to repeat too much of what Jerry and Ross have already said with respect to the interests of incumbent users. So look, NAB's primary concern in this proceeding is preserving and protecting the content distribution architecture that facilitates the distribution of video programming to well over 100 million television households across the United States and to millions of commercial and public radio listeners. That content distribution architecture relies on C-band spectrum, which provides an unusual combination of ubiquitous coverage across the country and near flawless reliability. So preserving a sufficient spectrum footprint to protect that architecture is our #1 priority in this proceeding. And we think it's a priority that, you know, is important to policymakers as well, obviously. I was struck when Teddy was introducing the previous panel and he was talking a little bit about the Capitol Forum. He was describing the evidence-based approach that the Capitol Forum likes to bring to its journalism. I'd like to emphasize the importance of having an evidence-based approach in this proceeding. When we talk about things like the merits of different proposals and the amount of spectrum that can be recovered, you know, NAB certainly isn't opposed to the reallocation of a portion of the C-band, but the conversation around how much spectrum is reallocated and what's done to protect existing users should be an evidence-based, fact-based discussion. It should not turn on sloganeering. I'm old enough to remember, before the incentive auction, the spectrum crunch that was going to lead to dropped calls and disaster for everyone's cell phones. You know, I hope that we don't allow the current version of that sloganeering and the race to 5G to overwhelm an evidence-based discussion about the appropriate way forward in this proceeding. Thanks.
Thank you. Jill.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for having me here to talk to you all about our views on the C-band. At NTC, I represent about 850 rural broadband providers, And we're in a bit of a unique position because all of our members offer fiber to their subscribers, but the vast majority also offer a video product. And then we have a number of members who offer a wireless product, both fixed and or mobile. So as an advocate, my primary job here is first to make sure that those that are using the spectrum for a service don't experience a loss or degradation of the service they provide to their subscribers. And I think these guys here are doing a good job carrying the water on that part. I think, though, that the other main point, our main job here as an advocate for our members is to make sure that as the spectrum is redistributed, if we will, it's done in a way that ensures that my members have a fair opportunity to obtain that spectrum. Not that they're guaranteed any rights, of course, but that they have that reasonable opportunity to obtain spectrum. So in our last survey of our membership, we had about 10 to 15% of those 850 rural broadband providers who are interested in potentially obtaining spectrum to offer a fixed product. And it'll be interesting to see if that number goes up if 5G delivers on its promises or as the technology improves. But right now, so we've got a number that are interested in the spectrum when we know will bid if there is any kind of spectrum auction. However, the CBA proposal, in my mind at least, can be compared most closely to a secondary market transaction, where you sell or partition the spectrum or lease a portion of it. And generally speaking, those kind of transactions don't work out terribly well for the small providers. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Suppose we have 50 providers who are really genuinely interested in a spectrum opportunity. They're interested in serving very discrete areas, and they have very limited resources. So the transaction cost for a provider to work with these 50 providers is quite high, and the return is quite low, compared to working with one or two nationwide providers who are interested in very large spectrum geographic areas or blocks of spectrum and have comparatively unlimited resources. So when you put these two groups together and you have to negotiate with them, we're in a very difficult negotiating position as the smaller providers. And it's, looking at a private market transaction, it is entirely possible that this private auction could be structured in a way that ensures a reasonable opportunity for my members to obtain affordable spectrum, right? It is entirely possible that could happen, and it would make those of us in the room who are, representing stakeholders either happy or equally unhappy, as whatever the case may be. But doing that, I think, sets a very dangerous precedent. The entire industry, this is very different from a normal secondary market transaction where you have a single company who maybe has a geographic area it's not interested in serving, maybe the economics don't work, or perhaps they need to partition spectrum so that they can meet its build-out obligations or whatever it is. Here you have an entire industry that's basically saying we have more spectrum than we really need. So, and therefore we should be able to make money on that. The spectrum, though, is truly owned by the public, not an individual company, and in that sort of capacity, the FCC has a role here to ensure that the public interest is served when it determines how the spectrum is going to be used going forward, if in fact there is spectrum available. We all here negotiate and represent our members, our clients, or our stakeholders. We don't represent the public, and that's what the FCC's job here is, to represent the public. Not everyone in this room or in any proceeding has equal bargaining power. We don't have equal money. So we're not in equal positions when it comes to negotiating for an outcome that is favorable to ourselves or to others. So just from the perspective of going forward, maybe, no one from NTCA is in the room on a future spectrum proceeding. Who's going to ensure that the public interest is protected in that situation? And I think that generally speaking is at the FCC's job. And maybe we can structure this in a way that there's so much FCC oversight that it basically becomes some sort of FCC-led but private market hybrid. But what happens in the next time or the time after that or the time after that. I do believe that to protect the small guys in the future of telecommunications services, we need the FCC to be the primary decision maker on all of this.
Okay, well, after the first panel was concerned we're going to have too much talk of consensus. Now I think we've dispelled that. There doesn't seem to be a consensus yet. You all have kind of staked out your positions. Jerry, I did, obviously, it was no surprise there's some objections and concerns, so I think I should give you an opportunity to respond to some of those objections if you care to.
Well, 3 of our panelists were very keen on protecting current services, and I have to say that I totally agree with Ross that we need to keep all of our customers whole and make sure that they have the same quality of service that they've had before. Now, where we disagree is that Ross says we haven't really come to meet their concerns. I think actually we spoke to their concerns a little too directly in the past. But essentially, we have given a detailed customer commitment in an April 3rd ex parte and letters to our customers telling them exactly how we will protect them. We have given a detailed listing to the FCC on how we will restructure the use of transponders when we add the 8 new satellites, and we've told our customers explicitly where they would be moved so that they know they'll get the same quality of service. And argument about higher prices is just a red herring, because the price of distribution is a tiny part of the overall percentage of what is paid for getting programming to cable systems. So we feel like we have a very transparent approach towards making sure that our users, in fact, are kept whole. They are our users. We've served this industry for 40 years. We have no interest in stiffing our customers, and we're a global business. We have to protect that. Public knowledge says, well, we should look to public auctions, and they point to the example that something that started in 2002 and ended in 2017. That's precisely what we're trying to avoid. We need to move quickly to protect the U.S. national priority for 5G. And I'll just simply have to say we disagree with them on whether the Communications Act makes this illegal. There's been a very spirited defense on the record of the legality of the approach that we put forth. We put a very large presentation. 309 J6E perfectly allows the FCC to go through this approach. And I have great sympathy for the NTCA, because we also believe that there should be services in rural areas. We've had a substantial outreach to all parties. We issued 400 letters to try and ensure that people knew which direction we're going. We have a substantial amount of outreach with all the players, and we definitely want to make sure that the rural services are continued, which was also a concern of others on the panel. So again, the main point here is to serve 2 national priorities, and you've heard them both on this panel and the one before. We think our approach is the best way to do it quickly, and if we wait for a public-driven auction approach, the U.S. will have no leadership in 5G, and it'll be years to come before anything actually happens.
If I can just jump in on that for a second. NAB hasn't taken a position on the merits of the CBA proposal as opposed to a public auction, but I do want to say that I think we have a position on what the terms of that debate ought to be. I'll repeat what I said earlier, that I think we ought to have an evidence-based discussion around that. And whatever you think about the CBA's proposal, whether you support it or not, I think they put a fair amount of evidence on the record, frankly, supporting their proposal and how they are going to accommodate existing users with their proposal. And to me, as one evaluates the merits of the CBA proposal as opposed to a public auction, one of the questions is, well, what's the evidence for maintaining access to sufficient capacity to continue to distribute content in a reliable and ubiquitous fashion using another mechanism? And I think the terms of the debate should turn on how we make sure that we do that, not just questions about, what's the right amount of spectrum, do we prefer a public auction or a private sale? So that's my perspective on that, and I do want to give Jerry some credit, I think, for the CBA's efforts to provide a little bit more transparency about the merits of their proposal and how they propose to maintain capacity for their customers.
Yeah. I'll add, I was mentioned a few times in the response. if I want to start positive, the CBA has provided more details in the record lately. And I think that's because that their deal has been more criticized lately. But we've been calling for more detailed information, transparency in this proceeding for a very, very, very long time, and it seems like their willingness to do so is dependent on what they think their chances are for the deal to be approved. So we are a bit dubious of the motivations for protecting your customers and the willingness. But I will say is that we put in an ex parte about a month ago detailing extensively a bunch of information that we felt was necessary in order for the commission and stakeholders to fully evaluate whether or not this is in the public interest. And on capacity, we asked for the current levels of capacity utilization, what level of capacity utilization the industry would need to operate at to meet current demand, and what are the expectations for demand in the future. We haven't seen any of those answers, and those answers are critical to understand whether or not 200 megahertz is the right amount or not. Because after this auction is done, and after they give us our filters, when the marketplace starts to fall apart, who's going to take care of rural operators and their customers? The money is already out the door. And so it's critical that we find out these answers. And there's no doubt that you put in more information about interfilters. But again, filters doesn't help if the programming is no longer delivered on the C-band and you all of a sudden have to build miles and miles and miles of fiber into very, very rural areas at costs that exceed what can be supported by a small cable operator of 1,000 subscribers.
And I'll just add, you know, there's a lot of talk about getting this out quickly. And, you know, doing it quickly doesn't mean doing it right. And I think it's far more important to do it right than it is to do it quickly.
Thank you, Chairman Pai. That's
exactly what he said.
Yeah, I believe it is too. And I agree with him. You know, I would compare it to, you know, I could run home tonight and I could paint my living room and I'll do a really lousy job at it. And someone else will have to redo it, and you know, when I get sick of looking at the mistakes, or I can wait and hire the professional and they can do it right the first time. And I think that this is a situation where it's better to have it done right the first time.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in, I guess, to complete the full set. Obviously, public knowledge would like to associate itself with the words of Chairman Pai. It's important to get it right. Wow, no laugh for that. That was I thought that was wow.
Public knowledge backs Pai.
That's right. Yeah. No. So I mean I don't think that there's, I mean, frankly, any disagreement on the panel that it's important to get it right. I think we just disagree about what getting it right looks like. And I mean, if you think about, you know, the timeline, you know, 18 to 36 months, you know, in spectrum policy, you know, that's incredibly fast. You know, I think as Jerry mentioned, but you know, I think usually in spectrum policy, you think of what's the best case scenario and then add years on top of it, and that's actually the real best case scenario. So like even under the best case scenario that Jerry mentioned, you know, 36 months, you've got significant litigation risk here. So assume, you know, 12 to 18 months at least for litigation risk on top of that. You know, if you think about the incentive auction in 2016 and 2017, the Spectrum Act passed the Congress in 2012. We completed the incentive auction in, I forget whether it was early Q1 or sorry, late Q1 or early Q2 2017. So, you know, around 4.5 to 5 years. You know, that's fast on spectrum policy, and it's not that much slower than sort of the best case scenario for what Jerry's talking about, and that would provide significantly more oversight, significantly more public input, significantly more opportunity for the FCC to consider the various trade-offs. You know, I think, you know, we've all been inundated by the race to 5G rhetoric, but you know, there are other public interest trade-offs here, as I mentioned before. You know, the rural broadband issues. Frankly, you have the worries about what precedent does this set for other underutilized spectrum bands going forward? You know, are we basically saying that, you know, if you're underutilizing your spectrum band, you get to hold out and demand a windfall, you know, for reallocation, refarming of those frequencies? It's a problematic precedent to set for the public interest, to say the least. So there's a lot to chew on here. So.
Any other responses, rebuttals, bad jokes, anything?
I would like also to associate myself with Chairman Powell. I like the analogy of painting your room because you need to get the professionals. In this case, we are the professionals. We operate the satellites. We've done it for 4 decades. We've done major shifts of customers when satellites have a problem or when we're trying to change the orientation of all the cable neighborhoods in the country. So, I mean, we have experience with this, and we know how to move our customers, and we've shown them all how we would do it. I will take exception to the use of the word underutilized because we are fully using our transponders. There's not space up there. We have to put 8 satellites up there to accomplish this goal. And if we don't do it, Patrick, your guys won't get served, nor will the cable systems, nor will anyone else. So that's why we believe that the satellite operators have to be an integral part of all of this. We're talking about speed and risks and litigation. China's already putting 5G out there. Europe already is putting 5G in this band. Japan, Korea. If we want U.S. leadership, we've got to move quickly. We recognize there's a litigation risk, but we think we can do this faster on top of any litigation risk, and we've given very detailed plans to the FCC on how we do it. And please don't question our motivation. Come on, it takes a long time to prepare all this technical information that we've done. Which has been going on the record, and we'll have more as we continue the effort to be transparent. This is one of the biggest and most interesting projects I think we've seen in spectrum policy for a long time, and we're very happy that we can be an integral part of it.
I don't think you could sidestep the importance of understanding the amount of the utilization of the spectrum today. I mean, you can't both say that it's fully utilized and then also say that we could free up 200 megahertz by repacking. I mean, clearly there is currently unutilized spectrum that can be freed up. And I think that the levels of utilization, the levels of current usage, and the levels of future demand are certainly important for the public to understand in order to evaluate whether or not the impact on existing users.
I mean, if I could jump in on that, not that it's my job to advocate for Jerry here, but I'll in fairness again to the CBA, I think they've been fairly transparent, at least with us, in terms of sharing information about their proposal and how much spectrum they think they can make available, how it's currently used, and the steps that they would need to take to match capacity and a smaller spectrum footprint. So again, whatever the mechanism is, I do think that the satellite operators know more about their systems than anybody else. They've done the work to determine that 200 is a number that they think they can live with while continuing to serve their customers. So regardless of the mechanism for reallocation, I think that level of reallocation is worth some deference.
Have they shared it with you privately? Yes?
Yeah.
And they've been unwilling to put it into the record.
Oh, actually, we have talked to the FCC and given them confidential information and shown them where our customers will be. This is competitively important information, and for both the antitrust and for our consumers' confidence and confidentiality, we can't give all that information out. No company can do that. But you're going to get all the information you want from the FCC's public notice, in which they asked by May 28th or 9th, I forget, a whole lot of information about capacity utilization and how the spectrum's being used. But we're pretty confident. We've given the FCC, we've given to the major actors information on how the spectrum will be reallocated. And it's not that there's underutilized spectrum now. We're proposing to add 8 new satellites to do this. And it's the only way you can do it. So, I mean, that's where we are right now. I can't add to that.
But you're replacing existing satellites with those new satellites.
Some of those satellites wouldn't be replaced. We have assessed our customers' future demands. We've talked with all of their customers to determine what their future contract needs will be, and some of the satellites simply wouldn't have been replaced. We're assessing, though, how if you add the satellites, you can accomplish two hugely important national priorities, both protecting all the programmers who feed into your systems and doing this super important 5G act. It's a delicate balance, and I think we've got it.
One other thing, just like, because these are some of the issues that ACA Connect's members are concerned about. This is a significant modification to the way that these operators, many in rural areas, have been receiving programming for a long time. And as I said, they've spent billions and billions of dollars, even by the CBA's all account, on the facilities that they are utilizing to receive this, to receive the programming that they are currently today. We've asked and put in the record, let's use a protective order so we can make this information available to all stakeholders. The information that you're talking about is no different than information that any party that is in a merger or other proceeding like that submits to the commission. A protective order is designed to protect it from the types of concerns that you have and allows for the transparency for people that are not involved in business-making decisions to review it. And it's concerning that we can't look at that information in order to evaluate whether the level of capacity and the means that this is going to be done is going to cause harm.
Seconded.
Well, I would third that we're not going to cause harm to your customers. Your members have a large investment in our stations. We totally agree. And you're going to receive the same amount of programming on different transponders. And we have given the FCC information on how that works. We have considered further and probably will give more information and certainly have to in response to this public notice. There's a large amount of confidential information for a $100 billion a year industry, and frankly, we need to protect that. Our customers' contracts require that, and we think we've given the FCC at least enough information to assess this, and our customers as well.
We're actually down to close to about 10 minutes to go, and I got about 15, 20 questions here that you all have already answered or at least dealt with the majority of them. So let me at least give the audience a crack here at any questions they want to ask. Anybody have any questions? Go for it.
Yes, question on the windfall issue specifically. Is there an argument out there as to why the C-band Alliance should capture all of the revenue from the sale of the spectrum?
Can they provide their affiliation, please?
Yeah, it'd be good. Yeah.
Alex from Thorntree.
Thanks, Alex. The basic issue is that we need the incentive to supply all the new satellites to do an extraordinarily complex job of restructuring the broadcast infrastructure. And it's no different from any other transaction which involves spectrum. There are tons of them, thousands of them, in which one party has sold something and has gotten funds from it. So, and the FCC has explicitly in several instances said that the amount of money going to another entity is important, but it's acceptable because we want fast action in restructuring the spectrum. And that's what this is all about.
Hi. So let's just say that all of the constituencies in this room and who have questions about the CBA, its motives, and the transaction that you're suggesting, let's say all of those constituencies could be satisfied. Is it in the public interest for the U.S. taxpayer to see a transfer of billions of dollars from U.S. companies such as Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, all other smaller players, to SES, which is essentially a French champion company? Is that in the best interest of the taxpayer?
Could I ask who you are, sir?
Yeah,
Because-
Ted Wachtel is my name.
Thanks, Ted. I worked with SES for a long time. I've never heard them described as a French champion. That's very interesting. But they are based in Luxembourg, so I'll give you that. No one has really questioned our service for 40 years in the United States, and the service we've provided has served the American taxpayer quite significantly. The amount of the money that's going to be realized is not pertinent to how we get to the 5G leadership that the country is talking about. You won't get there without going through a structure that involves the satellite companies. And the U.S. taxpayer will reap far more revenues and more benefits if we do this quickly. All the economists agree if we can get quick 5G action, the returns to the Treasury will be far more than some auction that may occur years in the future. So I really think this is more rhetoric than anything else.
Okay, but again, why shouldn't there be a process that takes into account what's in the best interest of the American consumer? And you say you're not a French champion company, but you know, the European satellite business is basically a closed market controlled heavily by SES and not open to US competition. So if there's an equal playing field, it might make some sense to have an open market transaction, but there is no equal playing field when it comes to the European market. So one would think that there is going to be some issue there on the part of the administration, maybe not on the part of the FCC, because that's not really necessarily their mandate with regards to 5G, but one would think that there are political overtones that are being missed here. I just wonder, can you respond to why we should consider SES an American company?
Well, I'm also the president of SES Americom, and I do consider it a substantial operator and actor in the U.S. market. But I have to challenge your basic premise there about Europe being a closed market. I lived and worked in Europe for an American-based law firm for 20 years and represented satellite companies, both American, European, and otherwise, and never would have considered that a closed market. And we're all subject to the same WTO obligations. This basic premise is just, I don't know where that's coming from.
Well, for example, what just happened between Viasat and Eutelsat in a joint venture that they were going to develop, and in the 11th hour there was a change of plans, a refusal to sign, and there was a deal cut by the French government to make the satellite in Europe and preclude that joint venture from occurring. I mean,
I
one
have
small
absolutely
example.
no idea what
One
you're
small
talking
example.
about, but this is getting so far into the weeds that are irrelevant to what we're talking about that I think, moderator, we might move on.
Yeah, I want to jump in really quick, just in response to the couple of questions we had back to back. So we talked a little bit about, I used the word underutilized, and I think, Ross made an important point. Essentially, C-band Alliance has come in and said, we're prepared to give up, up to 180, 200 megahertz of spectrum. So maybe it's not an explicit admission of underutilization, but it's at least implicit that there's some amount of spectrum that can be refarmed for other uses.
So hold it. Isn't the basic argument, just to interject, they're going to put up more satellites to squeeze it into the 300?
Yep.
I mean, can you?
Sure.
Feel free to hash that out. That sounds logical. I don't know the technicalities, but.
Yeah.
Well, let's just let SES explain. I mean, you're say 8 satellites, but can you break down the 8 satellites between those that are launch pad backups and those that are in orbit
kinda do that
spares?
in one of their-
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think we
So
did
we're
that pretty
talking about-
explicitly.
So we're talking, I think, about 2 or 3 satellites that are replacing satellites that are currently existing that are reaching the end of life. So they're saying that they're basically, we're adding more satellites by the fact that we are not replacing our existing satellites.
So Jerry, how many would be new, and how many are replacing?
We're going to procure, and we've been in advanced stages of RFPs with American companies to buy 8 satellites. 4 of them would be in full operation. 2 would be on-orbit spares so that we can ensure that there's continued service to our people, Patrick. And 2 would be on-ground spares because you have to ensure that you can quickly and rapidly deal with any kind of problems in the satellite, like any other telecommunications industry.
And how many of those are replacing satellites that are getting to the end?
I don't know the exact number on that. I mean, I think we've put that on the record, but I'd have to look at that, yeah, because I was
believe it.
rereading
I
through
believe
our
it's all of
comments
that.
and reply comments, and there are an enormous amount of detail.
You mentioned there are some antitrust issues if there's too much transparency. One of the small satellite operators have alleged that the C-band proposal excludes them in an anti-competitive way. How does that get resolved, and does the panelists have any views on any antitrust implications that are going on by the banding together of the satellite operators?
I guess I should address that at the beginning. We are certainly willing to that's Teddy back there. We're certainly willing to discuss ways to reach a compromise and agreement with the small satellite operators. Those operators have admittedly on the record said they have absolutely no customers and no revenues in the United States, and one could take the view they have no stake in the U.S. They don't have to replace satellites. They don't have to protect customers. So it's not really under any market definition a concept of competition problems vis-a-vis them. On overall competition problems, we've been very careful to make sure that our teams don't share any kind of anti-competitive information, and that when we present information to the FCC, we do it in separate teams. So we're trying to make sure that we dot our I's and cross our T's on that.
Any other questions? 2:28. Well, we've got a couple minutes left.
You can get through all the rest.
Yeah, I don't think. We'll just.
See them all at the same time.
Lightning round.
Yeah, I'm not sure which ones would be lightning
Yeah, yes or
rounds.
no?
Just, I mean, realistically, you can make this lightning round. What's your hopes and what's your expectations, or whatever you want to say, as to just when the FCC might be able to get to a decision on this? Any guesses? Projections?
Boy, I think John correctly characterized that on the previous panel as tea leaf reading. I think what everyone can agree on is there's going to be some reallocation of a significant portion of the C-band. Protecting incumbent users is going to be an important consideration, and the FCC is moving in my view, as quickly as they responsibly can, given the competing proposals on the record before them.
Yeah, I think Patrick's largely right. I think you've seen. It seemed like this proceeding was moving relatively quickly initially, but I think recently you've seen, Chairman Pai obviously, said it. I believe it was at ACA. He said it's important to get it right than to be fast. We saw Commissioner Carr, who said that he's hoping that the proceeding frees up more than 200 megahertz of spectrum that can be repurposed for flexible use. That seems to be divergent from some of the other from some panelists up here and some of the comments in the record. And then you've obviously this doesn't exist in a vacuum at the FCC. You've got Congress. You've seen Republicans and Democrats. You've seen Chairman Doyle on the Relevant Energy and Commerce Subcommittee. You've seen Senator Sullivan, who's on Senate Commerce. You've seen Senator Kennedy express concern, if not somewhat outright opposition to the private sale proposal. What we haven't heard is we haven't heard from the ranking member on Energy and Commerce. We haven't heard from the chairman or the ranking member on Senate Commerce. It'll be interesting to see if they choose to weigh in at some point. But I for my tea leaf reading, I don't know when the FCC would move forward, but it would seem that this has generated enough interest on the Hill, and some of the past precedents that have been concerned about private sales in other instances in the past. I think the FCC might be looking for a little bit more guidance here from Congress. So.
Well, we're pretty much up at the end of our time here. I want to thank the panelists, and we'll take about a 9-minute break here and get on the next panel. I would note